Hi everyone, welcome to this video lecture series on group counseling. This is the introductory video and I'm going to be exploring with you what we're getting into as well as give you some introductory notes on group counseling practice and some definitions you need to know. So what is this training series about? Well, you're going to be learning about the therapeutic factors of group work, like why group basically. Then we'll be looking at in our second module series together how to set up a group. Then we'll move into the stages of group work and what happens at different stages of the life cycle of a group. And then last we'll look at the different types of groups that are out there that you could lead as a counselor. So let's dig in and get started by learning about the history of group work. Well, how did groups start? How long have we been doing group work? Well, for quite a long time, group work began in the 1920s. Jacob Marino had developed psychodrama, which basically involves you taking on a certain role and attributing roles to other people in the group. It came out of psychoanalysis and was actually the first person to use the term group psychotherapy. In the 1930s, you saw a rise of Alcoholics Anonymous and other self-help groups since then, and of course AA has become a major phenomenon, and self-help groups by themselves have millions and millions of members. 1940s, you saw Kurt Lewin develop what are known as T groups, which was the first time that people who didn't have a major mental disorder would get together and try to understand, explore who they were and use group process for just really self-exploration. In the 1950s, you saw school guidance counseling get established, and so there became more and more of an interest in psychoeducation on providing basically educational content in group formats. In 1960, 1960s, we had Carl Rogers and his encounter groups emerge. And the encounter groups of the 60s were very much a kind of offshoot of the T groups of early years. And encounter groups again involved people who didn't necessarily have mental disorders getting together and sharing experiences and trying to understand themselves better. In Rogers' world, he would call it becoming a person. In the early 1970s, 1973, the Association for Specialists in Group Work was formed, which is now a division of the American Counseling Association. And so if you're interested in group work, that's an important division to consider belonging to. So that's really where group work started and how it got its kind of underpinnings. Now let's look at some definitions that are important when understanding groups. First, let's look at the word process. Process means how members interact within a group setting. Dynamic means the patterns by which the interaction happens, okay? So, and that really includes a lot of issues pertinent to group, such as cohesiveness, which we'll get into, group pressure and expectations of others, scapegoating, and other cliques that affect normal overall movement within a group. As we go through this video lecture series, I'm going to encourage you to use person-first language. When you read the classics, such as Irv Yalom, who's a psychiatrist, his language tends to be formal, but also to the point of being a bit old school, if we're honest. So he uses terms like schizophrenic, and that's inappropriate. We should now be using terms such as person with schizophrenia, person with autism, if that makes sense, because otherwise we're basically labeling people by a diagnosis, which is inappropriate. Okay, so I'm going to try to do that throughout. Okay, now we're going to move into the pros and cons of group work. Why would you want to do group work in the first place? Why is it important? Well, the pro is that it's more effective for some clients. Some clients, some issues are just better served through working it through in an interpersonal setting where you can kind of get in feedback from other people about your own interpersonal style. And I'm talking here about more of the long-term outpatient group setting that can be very useful for some clients. In addition to that, support groups are very useful to some clients who need resources. If you're, for example, a parent of a child with autism, you may need to know what resources are out there and you would best get that through a support group. Group work is also efficient and cost-effective in that you serve multiple clients in 1 hour, right, or an hour and a half. And I will add is a useful adjunct to individual work. So if a client is receiving individual counseling, sometimes they won't be able to work on their core issues around interpersonal considerations, for example, interpersonal issues, without being in a group setting. The cons with group work is that you get less time with your counselor or the group leader. And some clients really chafe at that, and they expect, basically, they make some kind of an inference in their mind that time with the leader equals effective counseling. Time with the counselor equals. And that's not necessarily true, because often in groups, the group members do the work, and the leader really has more of a facilitative role. Group work, if we're also honest, can be intimidating to some clients, particularly clients who are new to counseling, period, like they've never had counseling before, and to clients who aren't used to a lot of emotional, effusive expression. So a client, for example, who's being asked to describe their feelings about other people in the room, that may be really difficult for them to do. And I think especially clients from like non-dominant cultures, so by this I mean people of color, that can be particularly challenging. Organizational support can be a challenge in that you need to have your agency or your private practice or wherever you're doing the group needs to be able to support the group, to carve out time for it, carve out space for it. One of the other major issues with group work is confidentiality. And group members need to know that while you can maintain confidentiality for them, the other group members won't necessarily be tied to the same professional standards that you are. And so you cannot guarantee confidentiality for the person in a group. What you do as a group member, as a group leader, to help to some extent kind of minimize this impact is by discussing early on with group members the importance of keeping what's in group within the group and not talking to outside people about it. Group work is also a little more challenging to organize than individual counseling, because you have multiple people to gather together at the same hour. And so for that reason, it just requires a bit more organizational prowess, especially on the front end. Okay, so those are the pros and cons of group work. Let's now have a brief introduction to the different types of groups, and we'll be touching on these as we go throughout this course. The first is the process group. A process group is one in which members get together, they give each other feedback about how they relate to other people in the group. It tends to be more of a here and now emphasis, and I'll explain that term as we go as well. It also tends to be more open-ended and long-term process groups. They're very unlikely to be brief or short-term groups, okay, with some exceptions such as inpatient work. Psychoeducational groups have the really sole purpose of providing information and also helping members learn skills, such as coping skills, for example, in a CBT-like group. And for that reason, it can often include more members than process groups and don't necessarily need to last for as long. Task groups are next. Task groups you typically only find in organizational settings, and they're used to basically develop teamwork and camaraderie, that kind of stuff, by completing a task together, okay? And then last we have support groups or self-help groups, okay? And a support group is meant to have a very minimal input from the leader, and it's meant to be primarily member-directed, and that's where the power comes from the group. I'm going to kind of close out today, or at least this first video lecture, by talking about trainee groups. Now, in this in this program, I should say, you're being asked to do something very important, which is participate in a process group as participants. And that's so important because learning the role of a group member, learning the role of a client and what it's like, that experience of being a client, has a really important piece of your development. I can think about as myself when I grew as a counselor. I reflected a lot on my experiences as a client, and that really helped me understand where clients were coming from and their own experience. I'll give you a clear example of this. I don't remember today much of what my counselors told me, but I can remember how I felt with them in the room. And I think that really helped me as a counselor understand what matters in counseling. When you're in something like a process group as a graduate student, it's important for you to understand the importance of clear boundaries with your peers. In that, if you disclose everything and it gets super deep to the point where, for example, other students are sexually attracted to you, being one example, it's going to be very awkward to have classes together moving forward. So just be aware of that you're not in a formal group therapy endeavor, right? It's just meant to be more of a training experience. And actually it's useful to have some clear professional goals for that experience, such as, for example, wanting to become more assertive or wanting to become more, open to feedback. So I think if you have clear goals like that, it'll help you. I think the other thing we should say is that this course is going to help you understand the basics of group counseling, and you're not going to become an expert until you're practicing, until you're in the field doing it. And so during your practicum and internship experiences, you'll get that exposure and that ability. So just know that you're not going to be an expert by the time you're done with this course. It'll give you what you need to get started. I'll close with a thought for you, which is, I like to think long-term, and us as lifelong learners. When you're out there, post-grad, doing your work, there's a possibility that you're going to feel lonely and isolated. I think a lot of private practitioners feel that way particularly. And I think belonging to a group is very important postgraduate. And that could be a formal therapy group, like you're actually going to a group of therapists who are clients in a group, if that makes sense, members of a group. Or it could just be a support group for counselors. And I think just thinking about that for yourself and thinking how you're going to get supported in the work long term is worth mentioning as we close out our first introduction.